Thank you so much for sticking around after that very informative panel. I don't know about you guys, but I'm still trying to recover. My name is Tiffany Troxler. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Earth and Environment here in Florida International University in Miami, Florida. And so what we're doing today is this session is called Leveraging the Deep Bench, University Partners and Local Governments Working Together to Advance Climate Action. And we have representatives here from academia and federal government. And we are excited to come together to discuss how to build successful partnership models that advance shared climate and resilience goals. We've had a couple of great examples from Miami-Dade County about novel partnerships. We heard the Resilient 305 strategy, which is our region's resilience strategy, mentioned as one of those partnerships. We, as a collaborative, we call the Resilient 305 Collaborative, brings together local universities, local governments, and local NGOs to work on implementation, to support the implementation of that strategy through monitoring and evaluation, and specifically trying to help to narrow any potential gaps between how investments are being made and what local communities want from those resilience investments. And so we're working to develop a set of resilience indicators that can be used to help track success over time, and with the overall goal of learning from those investments and improving implementation of resilience over time. So that's just one example of a partnership. We've seen a lot of other examples of that, really wonderful examples from the Caribbean region. So we hope to talk more about how we can figure out ways to co-leverage these unique aspects of our regions and work together to help to operationalize resilience regionally. So let me introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Michael Taylor of the University of West Indies. He's a professor of climate science and dean of the Faculty of Science and Technology at the Mona campus of the University of West Indies. He's co-director of the Climate Studies Group, which explores climate variability and climate change for the Caribbean region. And then I'll also introduce Dr. Roger Pulwarty. He's a senior scientist at NOAA's Physical Sciences Laboratory in Boulder, Colorado. He is working on climate, disaster risk reduction, water resources, climate services in the US, Latin America, and the Caribbean with national and international agencies. And finally, we have Jamie Rhome, who is the National Hurricane Center's deputy director and also acting director of the National Hurricane Center in Miami since June of 2022. Thank you so much for joining us. So we'd like to get started with some opening remarks from each of our panelists. And we'll start with Dr. Taylor. If we could bring up his slides, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And let me thank you as well for sticking around after that session to hear what we have to say. So my name is Michael Taylor, and I'm from the University of the West Indies, located in Jamaica. And what I wanted to do with my opening remarks was very simple. I only have 2 slides, and what I want to do in the first slide is give you an example of how in the Caribbean we are trying to leverage university partnerships in the pursuit, with the partnerships between universities and government in the pursuit of valuable and meaningful climate action. And then in the second slide, I want to say, well, from that example, that story that I'm going to tell you, how do we then take that and make it into some kind of strategic approach? So every good story, of course, begins with once upon a time. So once upon a time, if you go back to about the year 2000, so somewhere around the 2000, I would argue that the Caribbean was at what I would call its first climate crossroad. And the essence of that crossroad was this. it was becoming very evident that climate was having an impact on the Caribbean way of life. So the manifestation, whether through the sea level rise, the higher temperature, the variable rainfall, or the more intense hurricanes, was beginning to affect life in the Caribbean and livelihoods of the Caribbean. And so it became very evident that action was needed. But the barrier to action at that point was an information deficit. And just to be very specific about the information deficit, it was that you had little knowledge about climate and the Caribbean at the scale of the Caribbean. And you had very little knowledge about climate and the Caribbean and the sectors and livelihoods that the Caribbean dealt with. And then you can carry it on, little quantification of therefore the climate impacts, little evidence of climate information being used to drive policy, even just little published information about, in the literature about Caribbean and climate. So the link there is Caribbean and climate information. So probably about 5 years after that, a coordinated science approach developed, led by our universities, and that's the example I want to give you. It was a multi-year, multi-country, multi-institutional, regional approach to dealing with climate science. And it was simple, led by the University of the West Indies with other universities and other regional entities, so universities in Suriname, our campuses in Barbados, Trinidad, other territories, with Cuba, their Instituto de Meteorología, with the 5 Cs who you heard about. The challenge was, how could we meet that climate deficit? Well, with limited resources, it had to be a collaborative approach, but it also had to be a coordinated approach. And so what we did was come up with a science framework. What is the information that we would need to move us beyond that climate deficit? To cut a long story short, literally, here we are 20 years later, and that partnership still remains. Those institutes meet every year, and we update our climate framework. And what has emerged? First of all, we have at least baseline data at the scale of the Caribbean. And so we have the downscale and the RCPs, the SRES, and we're moving on to the SSPs. They are in a database that resides at the 5 Cs. They are open to any climate scientist or any government scientist or any technical expert. It's the downscale Caribbean information. But more importantly, also tools relevant to sectors within the Caribbean emerged. So one example is the Accept Agri tool, which is for the farmers in the Caribbean, and it simplifies climate crop modeling for them to use, mixing it with climate data. But there are other tools that have emerged. And then we began to do the science. We gave the science to our policymakers to defend the policy positions of the Caribbean, because the Caribbean has its own climate policy positions. And lastly, of course, we managed to put the information out there in various forms. And so one of the recent releases was that there now is a State of the Caribbean Climate Report. And you can go to it to find out, well, what exactly is the state of the Caribbean? And a number of countries have also duplicated this with State of the Jamaica Report. So that's my story about being, how you try to leverage the university capacity to move climate action. What do we learn from this? That's my second slide. You learn from it that you have to be strategic. And if you're going to leverage the university partnerships, and the first part about being strategic is just defining the challenge. If we can define it simply, it's a challenge of sensitivity. The Caribbean region has this inherent sensitivity to climate that we just can't escape. We live it. That comes from our small size. We can't go anywhere, as you have heard. Our location, we're sitting ducks. But also because of things like our economic activities, they're all wrapped around climate. Our water is rainfall if you don't have it. And so there's this inherent sensitivity. What's climate change doing? It's taking that sensitivity and it's turning it into a vulnerability. That sensitivity we can't escape, but as the climate is changing, you're creating more and more vulnerable people. And that is part of the issue. And so the real challenge then is, what kind of action can we do to build resilience? Or put it another way, move from sensitivity, which is inescapable, down through to resilience. And so if you're going to our approach to leveraging universities, first of all, simply being strategic about defining the challenge, moving through sensitivity to resilience. It then is doing the kind of science to support resilience, which emerges out of that definition. So it's the science that, first of all, just has to set the parameters within which resilience action has to occur. So it defines those sensitivities, it enables attribution, it maps the vulnerabilities, and therefore your actions now become targeted actions. It has to be designed to support the processes which engender resilience building, those actions. So that's the tools, the science in support of decision-making, behavioral change, science to support the regional policy agenda. And then it has to be science that searches out transformative pathways in the pursuit of resilience. Science that tests, evaluates, innovates, creates contextual solutions, and translates. And so lastly, how do I sum this up? We are a region clearly of limited resources and resources that are dispersed. And the question is, how do you leverage universities in that kind of context? The Caribbean experience is that what you have to do is use university partnerships to do contextual science. It's not just anything. We don't have the luxury of doing whatever we want. It has to be contextual science. And contextual science rests on those pillars. Applicable. So it must be applicable to the region. Otherwise, we're going down a foxhole or something. It has to be useful. So you now have to take the science and be able to translate it so a decision maker can use it, and those kinds of tools. A key one, it has to be sustainable. And as we approach partnerships, the essence of partnerships must be not that you just bring a product, but that you create a sustainable resource within the region that will live beyond the particular partnership or project, but also that forms the basis for new partnerships. And clearly it has to be, contextual science is available science. It has to be put in a way that everybody has access to it. Thank you very much.
Dr. Taylor, thank you so much. Dr. Pulwarty, would you like to give your comments?
I will give it a whirl.
Thank you.
Greetings, everyone. Thanks for showing up. So one of my quickest things about uncertainty was a friend of mine who is one of the rain priests on the Hopi reservation likes to say, uncertainty is not what you don't know, it's what you know that is no longer so. Now that's a fundamental thing about learning, right? So as we think through some of this, there are three areas you hear, and you'll hear from us. Things are changing, right? You don't need to be the Dalai Lama to know that. So there's an opportunity to enhance knowledge and understanding, to strengthen dialogue, to enhance action and support, including finance and technology. You've heard quite a bit in the whole meeting about the changing nature of cascading and compounding risks. Not amenable to simple projections. So the problem of climate adaptation and understanding is one of across time scale, from extremes all the way to the long term. It is the short-term things that determine or constrain our long-term vulnerability. From that standpoint, we've tried to set up a few things in the region in partnership with the US and the Caribbean. On multi-hazard early warning system, you have one of the best institutions in the world, the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology. I'm not just saying that in a vacuum. I co-chair the Climate Service Information System Development for the UN. And in the evaluation, CIMH is, in fact, one of the best regional climate centers in the world. But we're working with them much more closely on multi-hazard risk, as you heard from Selwyn Hart this morning, and on a territorial or regional view to risk management. We heard today about different hazards all around the Caribbean, and the impact that Soufriere had on Barbados. One of the impacts it had was on putting dust on the PV cells, an issue surrounding energy that you might not have expected. But yet, working with the early warning information system across climate timescales, not just what are the projections and how do you respond, but how do we deal with climate across timescales became the way in which information was better provided to regions. It included at the same time the earthquake and storm you heard from. Another thing we're doing is creating national climate services frameworks with partners, DEMA, with 5Cs, with CIMH, and testing them in places from Belize, Trinidad, Dominica, Suriname, and Guyana. So one of the most critical things we're hearing is how do we make a coordinated view? And a killer innovation in all of this has been not simply thinking about integrated systems, exactly moving, as Michael just mentioned, multi-method, contextual, and problem-oriented, was to create a cadre of professionals out of Mona and out of Sermes at Cave Hill, whose entire role was to be the bridging mechanism in different agencies and institutions. We now have over 120 of them in different countries around the region. Resilient infrastructure is meaningless without resilient people. And from that standpoint, when we think about how networks are impacted, every one of us knows, the history moving from Andrew here to Mitch to Irma, Maria, to Dorian. The cascading hazards in a place like Puerto Rico, it took almost 3 months rather, to recover Wi-Fi, water, and medical services. So it's the networks that actually fail. That's the nature of cascading risk. So from my standpoint, the biggest challenge is one that Jeremy Collymore made. Among academics, we tend to think of grand challenges and meeting the needs of local people, but then we don't promote people who do that. We don't support those people. We don't create the institutions that give them the credit for building that network. We've tried to do that in NOAA and elsewhere through the Regional Integrated Sciences Assessments and other activities, but I want to keep in mind that one of the biggest things we need to be able to create is a marketplace for the idea of resilience and the governance that goes along with it. So to that standpoint, the networks we've tried to build are in climate services, are in multi-hazard early warning systems, and most critically, not just the capacity. I like to tell people capacity is not teaching people to do GIS badly, but the capabilities of individuals to be able to work, not just as boundary spanners, but to change the norms and the ways in which we think about resilience in the region. Happening slowly, not yet at scale. And so we need to move from pledges to implementation along the lines of what you just heard. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Rhome, would you like to take your comments from the podium? Thank you.
2 microphones. First of all, thank you for having me here. For those that don't know, the National Hurricane Center, in addition to what you know domestically, right? We produce the cone that everyone knows and loves. But we have an incredibly large international mission that is often not as publicly understood. And under the UN World Meteorological Organization, we are the regional specialized meteorological center for the Caribbean and Latin America, which means we provide guidance and science-based guidance to the member nations in that region. And to come here and talk to you today about a topic that is near and dear my heart, those of you who've known how long I've worked in the Caribbean know how near and dear this topic is for me. So thank you for letting me do something other than budget spreadsheets. And I'm not going to do a PowerPoint because I challenged myself to be nimble or responsive to whatever I heard in the preceding comments. And so I'm going to go off script a little bit. And poor Josh is over there thinking, oh no, there he goes. And I'm going to tell a story because I'm from the South and that's just what we do, is tell stories. But it's very relevant to not only this panel, but the extreme challenge that you're all grappling with today. I would say about 7 or 8 years ago, I was on a UN team, an expert team that flew around the world to help countries assess their ability to build storm surge models, capabilities, risk tools. And I would fly, show up, and be at this host country for a week. And at the end of that week, I would deliver the horrible news of, you don't have the capacity to do this. And after about 3 years of that, I really got sick of it. I just did. And I said, I'm not going to get on another aircraft until I can go somewhere and build capacity, not tell people about the capacity they don't have. They already know that. And coincidentally enough, a young professor from FIU stumbled into my office with an interesting proposal. At the time, the absence of bathymetric and LiDAR, or topography information, was a huge impediment. Still is in many respects. But it was a massive impediment to not only storm surge modeling, but sea level rise modeling. If you haven't had the opportunity or misery of doing a LiDAR project, you know it costs in the millions of dollars and takes years and years and years of processing, and then you got to do the bathymetry. And NOAA can't just pull its ships up within 5 feet of the coastline of another nation and pound away. So there's just this dearth of information that was desperately needed, and I just got so sick of going around the world and telling people, you don't have the data, and I can't give it to you. And so this young professor from FIU stumbled into my office with a radical idea that he was going to extract both bathy and topo from satellite. You know, somewhat risky now, incredibly risky 7 or 8 years ago. And everybody advised me to not do the project. It's risky. As a project manager, it's riddled with every imaginable red flag you can possibly imagine: cost overruns, delays, technical impediments, lack of science backing. You know, it was early. And I did it anyway. And for those of you who've seen the capacity build out in the Caribbean at a breakneck pace, it was based on the back of that partnership with and a crazy idea. So I tell you that story as you face similar challenges now with climate change in the Caribbean. The science is not always a slam dunk. The money's not always there, and it's incredibly risky. But guess what? We're going to do it anyway.
I'm a little choked up. What about you guys? Thank you so much for your comments. Okay, so let's go to the discussion questions. So we'll just have a couple of questions, and then we'll go to the audience for a couple of questions. So let's start with you, Dr. Taylor, if we could, and we'll hear from Dr. Pulwarty, if he cares to also comment. So we've heard a bit about the importance of leveraging relationships of the Southeast geographical location and shared vulnerabilities with the Caribbean to create among neighbors knowledge sharing, collaboration, and partnerships. How do you see, if you'd like to reiterate or elaborate on your comments, how do you see research institutions engaging with governments in the Caribbean on climate change?
Right. So if I follow on from my comments, and I think it's a recurring theme through what you hear here, there are two critical things. You know, clearly the first one that I'm trying to reiterate is context. You know, and so research partnerships must meet contextual needs. You know, and so even within the Caribbean region, that, you know, what are some of those contextual needs? Clearly, there is a data need. You know, there's need for data and for information, and I think that was very well brought out there with the whole idea of the bathymetry. And it's not just gathering of data, but then it's the constant monitoring of the data, it's the evaluation of the data, it's the analysis that supports it. And I think there's a clear role for the research institutions there. There's a clear role, you know, in bringing out, in preparedness and early warnings, and I think that has emerged straight through the whole day. And I think there's a role within the Caribbean region for research institutions to play that. Probably I should make a little distinction that, and I think Hillary was her name, from the Virgin Islands, was making that point this morning. The small islands of the Caribbean have a slightly different context from the United States. So in the United States, you have government and government structures and multiple institutes that deal with disaster risk, and you heard it this morning. Your counterpart does not exist to the same scale, or maybe not at all, in the Caribbean region. And so research institutions and universities have to pick up those kinds of roles. You know, and that's a critical thing. So when you're looking for partnerships, the persons you are looking for partnerships may not exist in what you think should be the counterpart institution because of the limitations within the region. But then there are other roles for the universities as well. Clearly, once you provide the data, it's using the data to support the policy positions. And I think I was trying to say that. A good example, the small islands took up the whole idea of 1.5 to stay alive. No more warming than 1.5 degrees. Well, where is the data to support that at the small island states? But that becomes a mandate. So supporting those kinds of policy positions. And there are new policy positions, loss and damage, and the importance of that. Providing the tools for the decision maker, because it's not just importing a tool, but it's a tool that supports, again, the contextual need. It's that farm, or it's health in the context of the Caribbean, or it's renewable energy in the context of the Caribbean, which has to be in a mix of energy options. It can't solely be renewable energy. And then, of course, universities have to serve on advisory roles and pick up the education and awareness and infuse that education right through the education chain from the child going up. There is this huge role that universities have to play within the Caribbean region.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. It would...
Sure, I give a
little
quick comment? Yeah.
Sure.
So thanks. In that context, one of the things, and I mentioned some of this, we started an effort in 2003 at the University of the West Indies in Cape Hill and Barbados to create this cadre of people who would go back into the public. Michael is doing very similar things from the standpoint of climate information and modeling, to be the resources within places. Now, this is much beyond co-production. Co-production can help lead to, hey, let's develop something together, even if it's not what's needed. This is actually who plays the role in ensuring that the assumptions by which we plan are borne out by what we know about the climate system. And in that setting, it becomes very important to understand that from early warning to anticipation, risks are interconnected. So there's research to be done there. There's research on how we build networks and sustain them for a long time. But again, to Michael's point and to the types of work that you're hearing, the notion of studying a process is to have knowledge of a process. The notion of implementation is to be in the process. A new area for academic research is really to produce practitioners who are in and off the process at the same time, like the person to the left of me here. The idea is really, many people might know, the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility uses the Hurricane Center winds as the basis for some of its derivatives. Use-inspired research, that space that is being created by Michael and others, is not as widely supported in the region as it should be. It's not as widely supported in the US as it should be. So crafting and creating a new cadre of professionals who are in and off the process, who can analyze where they're in, but also understand the contingencies of implementation, is the space, I think, that academia needs to shape.
Thank you. Jamie, do you have any additional comments?
I first want to respond to, I'm in a process. I work for the federal government, so I'm definitely in a process. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to keep everybody awake after lunch.
We'll give them the forecast.
Oh, yeah, I understand I'm supposed to be releasing a seasonal forecast. There will be storms. The seasonal forecast comes later in the spring as we march towards hurricane season, so I have nothing Twitter-worthy at the present time. But I do want to speak to the building academics that are more practitioners. I think that's what that's going to be increasingly important as we move into a society that has to be more nimble. I think we heard from the mayor earlier, or someone, that the debate is kind of behind us. And now we need to be into action. And what that action is desperately needs strong science to guide it. Because guess what? In the absence of science, policy will be written regardless. And it might not be what you want. So we need a group of young people who are ready to get after this, and not in a deliberative 10-year debate, but a 10-month action plan, because our future generations are going to really, really depend on what we do over the next 10 years.
Okay, so thank you very much. Let's talk a little bit about disaster preparedness. So we know that many people are either unwilling or financially unable to heed the warnings that are provided to avoid harm. Can you share any experiences of what we can do to better protect people and the physical and environmental assets they depend on as we continue to experience more frequent and intense extreme weather associated with changing climate? And start with Dr. Pulwarty.
Alrighty. I'll give the other two something to disagree with. So as we think through this, one of the things we just finished was the International Science Council review of Sendai. Are people familiar with what Sendai is? The UN Disaster Risk Reduction Agreement from a few years ago in Japan. And within that, as we think about the role of information, the role of knowledge, and the partnerships therein, there's something I would raise. Yes, there's retrofitting. Yes, there's information on building new and better buildings. Yes, there is this issue that not everyone can afford to move from places of risk, service economies and so on. But there's a component that didn't actually come out as strongly from the Biodiversity COP in December or the Climate Change COP, Conference of Parties. And that is the fact that if we do not craft information systems that make risk transparent as an accumulated function, and what I mean by that is, yes, there's the hazard, yes, there's the response, but the risks and responses are also based on how we use land and how we use building structures and where they are. Risk is accumulated over time, and the event exposes that accumulation of risk. We're not as aware in the way we work on making that more transparent. And the reason why I'm saying this, and this could raise some hackles, somebody helped create that risk. Putting people into places of risk in terms of land use, in terms of agreement. And we need to make that as transparent as possible, because the economics of it, and you heard that earlier today, is that when we manage risk better, you actually make more out of people's well-being and livelihoods. The problem is when we use numbers like $1 today saves you $4 or $5 in the long term, as the dismal science tells us, in the long term we're all dead, so therefore that $1 can't be spent right now. So I want to keep in mind that the one thing we need to be clear on is making the risks more transparent, making the partnerships that actually improve human well-being and environmental well-being more transparent, and creating early warning information systems that gives us the probability of the hazard, but also are combined with how the resources, landscapes, and development have been either depleted or built up that actually makes a hazard become a disaster. So I think there are opportunities for transparency in what constitutes risk.
Transparency and what constitutes risk. Dr. Taylor, do you?
I'm going to
Do you
adopt
agree or
something
disagree?
from the previous panel of ditto. But I think I don't disagree, because what I know Roger is speaking to here as well is part of what the university's function is, which is, first of all, just to map those risks. What are those risks? And again, speaking to, again, I keep going back to contextual science, within the particular context. And that risk, even within one country, may be different within different communities. So it's mapping that and making those extremely transparent. So I take up the word. The other word I would use, however, is then after you go after transparency, go for translatable, so that the risk does not exist within the domain of the academic or simply the government or that kind of thing. You have to make it translatable to the person for whom the risk is real and very, very relevant. And that's something that I don't think we're doing as well as we should be doing at all levels, from government, even academia, etc. Because once it becomes translatable, then you create an awareness, and then you take the knowledge then, and I suppose the third word that really comes to mind is take that knowledge of that risk then and somehow transform it into some kind of transformative action. So that means going into the community. So you know the risk, you have made them aware, but you can do things before, and I heard it in that housing panel earlier today. You don't need to wait until the actual the hurricane is upon you to activate the early. There are social interventions, there are build technical interventions, so you turn it into